My name is Will Inboden. I teach at the University of Texas at Austin and am also honored to be an associate scholar with the Religious Freedom Project at Georgetown, one of the event sponsors here. Not to be intellectually competitive or anything, but I noticed that the panel before us took some pride in talking about covering 1,000 years with just their 4 panelists in a hour 15. That is really but a vapor, but a wisp of time compared to our ambitions here, where depending on where you date Kyle's talk, we're going to be covering probably about 3,000 years, and the entire globe while we're at it. So please buckle yourselves up. I hope you had ample espresso over lunch. Again, as with the other panels, we have a very distinguished set of scholars here you'll be hearing from shortly. I refer you to the program guide for their detailed bios, but in order from my right to left, we've got first Kyle Harper, who is a professor at Oklahoma University. He was also the senior vice provost there and the director of the, what was it, Kyle? The Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage. He's a distinguished classicist, and we'll be hearing from him first. After him, we'll have Bob Woodberry. Bob is a former colleague of mine at the University of Texas, Austin, and is now teaching at the National University of Singapore, also directing the project on religion and economic change. Then right next to me here, we have Don Miller, who is teaching at the University of Southern California and also directs the Center for Religion and Civic Culture there. And then finally, we've got Dan Philpott, a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. I can't, as an American football fan, and I hope I'm not the only one here, I also can't resist pointing out that the 4 American universities you have represented here, Texas, Oklahoma, Notre Dame, and USC, also have very distinguished football programs and some fierce rivalries represented. And I don't know how many national championships are represented here. That's right. So, okay.
We have 7.
Yeah, depending on how you count a couple of them anyway. And yeah, Notre Dame would claim more. So anyway, so all right. Anyway, it's that time of year back in the States. As I mentioned earlier, we have a very ambitious chronology and range of topics to look at with this panel, all under the rubric of the conference theme of Christianity and freedom. I think you'll be hearing from the different speakers both ways that Christianity, different Christian traditions have contributed to positive development of human freedom, but also ways that the Christian tradition has helped to address both think anew intellectually and conceptually, and also inspire social movements against severe violations of freedom, abuses of human dignity and freedom, be they slavery or sexual coercion or autocracy or dictatorship. And you'll also hear some more particular reflections on how some particular Christian traditions, Pentecostalism and Protestantism and Missionaries, have, out of their own confessional or religious distinctives, brought their own distinctive contributions to the development of freedom as well. So as with previous panels, each speaker will spend about 8 or 9 minutes summarizing his paper, and then we will have a discussion involving all of you. And may I remind you that when you raise your hand with a question, I call on you, please first identify yourself, your name and your affiliation, and then your question. So with that, we'll begin with Professor Harper.
Thank you so much, Will, and thank the organizers of this wonderful conference. I feel very honored to be a part of it. I'm so honored that I won't complain about being asked to speak during siesta, and I won't be offended if you nod off. I want to talk about the history of human rights in the very big picture. And I would start by saying that we can think of 3 broad phases in the history of human rights, each of which kind of starts at a distinct moment. The most obvious is 1948 with the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is part of a reaction to fascism, a broad effort to create an international order with international institutions that have the potential to enforce human rights claims and certainly to promote human rights norms globally. And so there's an institutional dimension of that, and then there's a non-institutional, or at least a non-governmental dimension of that, of which I would say this conference and so many of the participants here today with an interest in global human rights are distinctly a part of. And so that's one phase, is the triumphal phase. We live in an age of human rights when all people of right sound mind would agree that human rights form a kind of foundational basis for political institutions and their legitimacy. But that phase in itself that takes off from 1948 has its roots in the late 18th century, in the late Enlightenment, and particularly in the political revolutions that are spawned by the Enlightenment, especially or most visibly the American and French revolutions and the great proclamations of 1776 and 1789, which are universal claims for rights, for human rights. And I would include as well the rise of the abolitionist movement, something that I'll come back to, very much a fruit of the same tree, the late Enlightenment birth of rights. And there's a certain tendency in looking for the genealogies of modern rights to look back to the Enlightenment moment. But I argue in the paper that I've written for this conference that there's actually even a deeper genealogy that goes back, we might say, to the conversion of Constantine in 312, and in particular, the politicization, the rise of public Christianity in the 4th century that we heard so much about in the last panel. And so to make this claim that, in fact, the 4th century, broadly late antiquity, the period when Christianity becomes public, when it becomes an accepted religion, when it becomes a political religion, is a distinct and, in fact, crucial phase in the development of human rights, relies on a certain kind of conceptual distinction that I tried to mark out. And this goes back to something, a very important point that Professor Rist made, that there's a strong tendency in today's, in philosophy today, to try and reach the conclusions of Locke without some of the metaphysical premises. And the main route that people try to do it is through Kantianism. And so I think we live in an age of ascendant, secular Kantianism that tries to ground universal rights claims in a kind of secular Kantian philosophy. And to me, this is actually overlapping but distinct from a kind of Lockean libertarian tradition of rights that's particularly pronounced in the Anglo-American tradition. And there's very much an effort in the late 20th century to look to a universal Enlightenment reason as a way to kind of ground rights. And something you've seen arise over the last 10 to 15 years in particular in the scholarship is a new interest in the idea of dignity as the grounds of rights. How do we justify rights? Through claims, through assertions of human dignity. And then in turn, claims to dignity are grounded in the idea that humans have dignity, that they have a kind of high worth, maybe an incomparable worth, because they are the bearers of moral reason. And so I'm very interested in tracing the genealogy actually of that concept. I would say that logic. Where does that logic come from? That every individual human being, that humans universally are the bearers of a kind of incomparable worth that is an extension of their capacity for moral rationality. And that logic, although not the language of rights, seems to me to have its roots distinctly in the 4th century, in the period after the conversion of Constantine. When you don't find, it's true, anything like declarations of rights, you don't see assertions that all humans have rights, you certainly don't see a kind of political charters that are grounded in rights claims. But nevertheless, you start to see very distinctly, and I think quite powerfully, the logic, the reasoning that underlies more modern Enlightenment rights claims, in particular, the idea that all human beings have dignity. And I think there's a sense, particularly among people who are sympathetic with the Christian tradition, that Christianity plays an important role in the creation of ideas of human dignity, and that the image of God is somehow a fundamental turning point in the history of human dignity. But at the same time, I think there's a lack of specificity and a kind of lack of empirical detail about these sorts of claims. And so what I try to do is to look at particular social institutions in the 4th century, in antiquity, and see how Christians react to these social realities, these social and institutional realities of the world that they suddenly become a very important public part of in the age after Constantine. And so in the paper I take 3 topics: slavery, sexual coercion, and poverty, and trace certain Christian reactions, and in particular try and identify what was distinctive about Christian reactions to these kinds of social problems that I think we would find and secular liberals would find morally questionable, morally problematic at an obvious level. But in fact, if you look history, if you look at the big sweep of human history, for most of human history, in fact, were not considered morally problematic at all. And so I think it's useful to ask, when did slavery even first become morally problematic? And this is the first case study, if you will, that where I try to identify what are the most progressive pre-Christian attitudes towards slavery. And it's simply the case that Greek and Roman, Greek and Latin, moral philosophy, even the most progressive edges of it, like Stoicism, lack the moral resources to offer a political critique of slavery as an institution. And so, although there is a kind of narrative out there that Stoicism or Platonism, various ancient philosophies kind of paved the way for Christianity. In fact, I argue if you look at particular social institutions like slavery, there's an utterly distinct break, that there's somehow a kind of leap of logic that occurs with the rise of Christianity to a public philosophy. And so, if you take the case of slavery, the Stoics never criticized slavery as an institution. And again, going back to something that Professor Rist said, which I think is a very important point, there's criticism about that's grounded in the moral health from the master's point of view, the moral well-being of the agent, but not of the victim of certain practices and institutions like slavery. And so you simply don't find that philosophies like Stoicism, which do say that all human beings are possessors of moral reason, but you don't see any criticism of slavery, the practice of slavery as an institution. That begins to change, I think, radically in the 4th century. And I would qualify this by saying that what you don't see arise in the 4th century is an abolitionist movement. A scholar of the period has written that the scriptural core of Christianity provided no articulate program of social reform and little impetus to change on the question of slavery. The command that slaves should obey their masters in the flesh with fear and trembling allowed Christianity to absorb the slave system with a minimum of inconvenience. And that scholar was me, so I can vouch that it's true. There's not a movement, there's not an abolitionist movement in late antiquity. It doesn't become broadly political or reformist, and certainly not in a constitutional sense. But it's nevertheless, I think, equally significant that for the first time in the 4th century, in fact, among a group of bishops in what's now Turkey, in Cappadocia, you find actual full-fledged criticisms of slavery as an institution. And in particular, I look at the social thought of an important Nicene bishop in the middle to late 4th century named Gregory of Nyssa, who's the first person to say that slavery is categorically wrong. And it's a remarkable document, a sermon. He's preaching on the book of Ecclesiastes, and just absolutely launches on an unexpected and unprecedented tirade that says all humans have dignity. And in particular says, think about the slave sale. How could you exchange money for the image of God? What has equal value? What has equal worth to the image of God? Human beings have moral reason, and you cannot put a price on moral reason. And it's an extraordinary argument. There's nothing like it in Stoicism, and for the first time you see this kind of logic that says human beings have dignity, and this has political, this has practical, this has institutional, this has social implications. And what a courageous kind of train of thought. It's almost like the Christian social gospel is a moral light switch. It's a flip. It's not a kind of gradual incremental improvement. It's a kind of argument, a kind of logic that was utterly unprecedented in the ancient world. Now, the great tragedy is that this has utterly no consequence in ancient Cappadocia, in ancient law. But nevertheless, for the first time, you see this kind of logic, and it's squarely grounded in the idea that all human beings are creatures in the image of God, and they therefore bear a kind of moral rationality that can be violated by particular social arrangements. And so then I trace out two other case studies, if you will, that are very similar. One follows the history of sexual coercion. In the ancient world, what we would call mass-scale institutionalized rape was simply accepted. Slaves had no rights. They had no autonomy over their bodies. Christianity enters the world with a very heightened sense of the particular moral significance of sexual behavior. And eventually, in late antiquity, this too becomes politicized in the wake of the rise of a public Christianity, when bishops begin to say, actually, it's problematic to preach that certain kinds of sexual behavior are moral and bear on the eternal fate of someone's soul if they don't bear the actual material capacity to make decisions, to control their own bodies. And so you see the first moral critiques from the victim's point of view, saying it violates their moral autonomy and their human dignity to deprive them of sexual autonomy. And this, fortunately, has a more concrete impact. In fact, it results in a series of laws, beginning in the dynasty of Theodosius, and then reaching the culmination in the legal program of Justinian, in which the emperors publicly banned sexual coercion, the enforced prostitution of slaves. And again, there's absolutely nothing like this in the pre-Christian period, and the logic of it is distinctly a logic that's rooted in the kinds of claims that people have because they are creatures with dignity. And you find these arguments for the first time again in the Cappadocian Fathers. And then the third case that I look at, which is a little bit different and maybe a little unexpected, is poverty. And you see very concrete arguments that human beings have certain kinds of entitlements because they are creatures in the image of God, and the experience of poverty, again, somehow degrades, it injures their natural human dignity. And again, there's nothing like it in pre-Christian social thought. And it's extremely important, in fact, more important than the Christian response to slavery or sexual coercion. It's much broader. It's less isolated to the Cappadocian Fathers, that says there has to be some kind of response grounded in our beliefs about human dignity. So I make these arguments from case studies that I think show that in response to these kind of practical social and institutional problems, that Christian leaders in the 4th century began to deploy a kind of logic that had never existed in the world. And so I think this is important because, one, it's simply accurate. And so if we want to say where do the kinds of claims for human dignity that underlie modern rights claims, human rights claims in particular, come from, I think for historical accuracy, there's a certain need to look at the 4th century as a crucial, maybe the crucial chapter in this story. But I also think at a final level, it's important because it should remind us all to look not just at kind of abstract ideas of rights and freedom, but actually the importance of material conditions. Slavery, sexual enslavement, and poverty are all material and social conditions that somehow impede and infringe and injure human dignity. And one of the great legacies of the church is to use the idea of the value of human dignity to think about the material, the practical implications of the way that people experience moral autonomy. So thank you very much.
My research is about the social impact of Christian missionaries, and I use it as sort of like a natural experiment to make arguments about religion and its social influence, not only in Europe and North America, but more broadly. And so I argue that a lot of things attributed to the Enlightenment at best is a confluence of streams in which the Enlightenment is one stream that flows into something that's much earlier and has Christian roots. And I can show this through the spread of Masons and white settlers around the world, as well as missionaries, and show that a lot of the key developments that happen around the world are shaped through missionaries as opposed through Masons or settlers. Now, I'm covering a lot of ground. I realize there's a lot of historical complexity, and there's changes over time, which I can't deal with. Some of my arguments may be startling to some people, but I also use statistics as a way to sort of measure the effect that missionaries have had. Statistics don't remove the fact that there's variation in terms of what missionaries do. They give you the average effect. So one way of phrasing it is, if their main effect was sort of negative in terms of destroying cultures or other things like that, we'd expect conditions to be worse where they had longer influence, and more freedom from state control to do whatever they want. And we find exactly the opposite on all kinds of outcomes. And the effects are quite strong. I'll look primarily at the impact of Protestant missionaries, which I have better data on, but also I think they were more distinct in the 19th and early 20th century. Since then, there's been changes, and earlier there is also different. But I'll focus primarily on Protestants. And basically argue that elites all around the world have tried to maintain their control over resources. One of those resources being control of texts, control of education, control of organizational resources, etc., and have resisted expanding those resources to other people. And one of the main things that has expanded those resources to others have been religious conversion attempts, missionary movements, or conversionary movements, particularly originally from Protestants, but now more broadly. And so when we talk about something like religious liberty, I think it's also important for us to recognize the importance of the freedom for conversion and freedom for missions, because that has what historically has created the threat that has gotten elites to undermine their economic and political interests and transfer resources to non-elites in a way that undermine their power in the long term. So if we look at the spread of mass education, missionaries were crucial in the spreading of mass education. Most white settlers and most colonial administrations didn't want lots of people to have education. It was primarily the Protestant missionary movement and also Catholics in contexts where they were not controlled by the state and where they were competing with Protestants who expanded mass education around the world. And it was also in terms of changing how education was from archaic languages or foreign languages into the vernacular and making graded classes that were according to ability level. We can also see this in terms of the spread of mass printing. Here it's easier to identify because you can actually see when the first printer was and who the first printer was and where they got their technology. Protestants wanted people to be able to read the Bible in their own language, which meant they had not only to be able to read, but they needed to have access to cheap copies of the Bible that were in languages that they could read and understand easily, which is the vernacular. And so when we look at the spread of printing around the world, printing was not developed in Europe. Printing was not developed in Europe. It was first developed in East Asia. They had it over 800 years before Europe. They had movable font type before Europe. They had movable font metal type before Europe. It didn't have the same consequences that it had in Europe, and it didn't spread beyond Mahayana Confucian societies. Even when the Mongols invaded China, the ones who became Buddhist printed, the ones who became Muslims printed money, which people didn't like, so they stopped, and printed amulets, which people did like, so they continued, but they didn't print books. You have the spread of woodblock technology used for printing cloth and other things, including words on cloth, but people didn't use it for printing books. They had plenty of trade with China, but they didn't copy the printing technology in most of Asia and the Muslim world. They copied paper, they copied other things like that, but not printing. They had contact with Europe as well. Jews who were persecuted in Spain went into the Middle East and Central Asia. They printed, nobody copied them. Catholic missionaries went to across Asia. They printed in small numbers. They taught Eastern Christians to print, who printed in small numbers. Nobody copied them because they mostly were printed in small numbers for priests, etc. Western trade companies, the Dutch East India Company, the French East India Company, the British East India Company, all printed, and nobody copied them. Most of the major languages of Asia had been created fonts by the 1600s. Nobody copied them. The Portuguese even gave functioning printing presses with vernacular fonts to the Mughal Emperor and the Persian Emperor, and nobody used them. So it wasn't that people didn't have access to printing technology. It wasn't that people didn't know how to print. It wasn't that you didn't have wealthy, comparably wealthy countries in Asia. It wasn't that they didn't have good metalworking technology. It wasn't all kinds of things. You didn't have the religious motivation that made printing valuable and undermined elites' attempt to try and control access to books. We see a similar pattern in terms of the rise and the spread of voluntary organizations and social movement organizations, which developed originally among non-state religious groups in order to run their organizations without state money, and also to do religious revivals, and then also to do social reform movements like temperance and abolitionism. Those spread around the world with the missionary movement and are important in terms of the rise of nationalism and other social reform movements around the world. You can see the effect. A lot of people who just focus on Europe talk about the expansion of the state or the expansion of the bourgeoisie. The difficulty is these organizations crystallize in England, the United States, including the Western frontier as well as the East Coast, India, and among groups like the Khoisan and Xhosa in South Africa at the same time. So if you're saying it's state penetration, you have the problem that Western frontier of the United States and groups like the Khoisan in South Africa don't have a large bourgeoisie, they don't have a lot of state penetration, but they're doing these petitions and marches and various protest tactics that we think of as being sort of this modern thing that develops in response to the state. Missionaries spread these organizations around the world, and they use them to try and reform things in societies that they don't like, but those are copied by other groups who are then competing with them. Missionaries, when they were not financed by the state, were also crucial to colonial reform movements. Some people who were in mission organizations that were funded by the state did oppose abuses, but those protests tended to be short-lived and didn't tend to actually lead to long-term changes in actual behavior. We can see this in terms of the rise of immediate abolitionism, which is directly connected with the missionary movement, where missionaries who worked with slaves sort of backed into becoming more and more radicalized as it became clear that slavery was incompatible with missions. And it was a gradual process, mostly influenced by the fact that slave leaders that missionaries taught to read and organized were people who led slave uprisings, and then slave owners tried to kick out the nonconformist missionaries and burn down the churches, and you get this radicalization of the nonconformists over time, who pressure for abolitionism. They're crucial in lots of other colonial reform movements. I don't have time to talk about all of them. But one of the things where you can see this effect in very stark terms is when we compare Belgian and French Congo, which in the early 20th century, you have all this demand for rubber. And so they set up monopoly trade companies that go in and try and extract resources, extract rubber from the jungles. And in both societies, they use forced labor, and they also use punitive raids against villages. So they would impose rubber quotas on villages. If they didn't produce their quota of rubber, they would send in armies that would burn down the village and kill people. And they would sometimes, this is not always, but they would sometimes chop off people's hands or penises to prove that they'd killed people. And then they would smoke them, and they would bring them back and be paid in iron rods for the work that they'd done. In that context, you get roughly close to 50% population decline in 20 years. Now, both of these abuses are happening at the same time in the French and Belgian Congo. You get the largest international protest movement since abolitionism in Belgian Congo, and you get no protest in French Congo, except for one article that appeared in a Marxist newspaper. And I argue the reason for the difference is you had Protestant missionaries who were in Belgian Congo who photographed the abuses and smuggled out photographs and accounts of it, and then went around US and Canada and Sweden and stuff, creating international pressure for reform. So you can show these in terms of like natural experiments, how these influenced reform movements, which have long-term consequences. Now, you can then, the next thing is to say, what impact did these things have long-term? And so I try and measure those statistically. One, directly trying to control for the factors that shape where missionaries went, because maybe missionaries just went to places that were already healthier or already wealthier or already more educated. And so then when we look at the number of missionaries or the length of missionaries, we're artificially giving them benefit, making it look like they were the ones who caused something that was not what they caused. It was why they went there. So you try and remove those effects. And still find very, very strong effects of missionaries on all kinds of outcomes. But you can also use different things like natural experiments. So if you look at the country of Nigeria, the British were very concerned about allowing missionaries in Muslim territories because they responded more violently, and the British wanted to run their colonies cheaply. So originally they had banned missionaries entirely. They were forced to allow them after 1813. But in Nigeria, they made a line, a straight line, through the country, and they said missionaries are not allowed to go north of this line. Now, this line doesn't correspond to anything on the ground. It cuts ethnic groups in half, and it doesn't correspond to provinces or anything now. It no longer exists. Now, if you look at 10 kilometers north of that line and 10 kilometers south of that line, you find that the people south of that line, where missionaries were allowed to work, are currently more educated, have higher incomes, have better housing construction, have more durable goods, have longer life expectancy, have lower infant mortality. Same ethnic group, 10 kilometers on either side of a line that no longer exists. That only exists for about 25 years. Or if we look at the German colony of Togoland, which in World War I was divided between the French and the British. Now the French were anti-clerical, and so they restricted missionaries. The British allowed them, but they only allowed them in the north because they didn't want them in the north. I mean, they only allowed them in the south because they didn't want them in the north where missionaries, where Muslims were. So if we look across the border, this artificial border that was created in World War I, there's no difference in the north in education rates. But if we look in the south, there's a step, a big step that's right at the border, where on the British side, there's higher educational rates than on the current Togo side, right at this border line. It's like a step where you have differences in education rates. Along this line where missionaries were allowed, but there's no difference in the north where missionaries were not allowed by either power. We see the same thing in terms of subnational variation in India, subnational variation in China, etc. Even if in China you think all this thing happened in between which wiped out the effect of missionaries, if we just look at the change in missionaries that happened due to droughts and floods, so missionaries went to serve in droughts and floods and then stayed to work on. If we just look at change in missionaries that happen due to droughts and floods, which are unlikely to benefit the economy and don't benefit the economy after missionaries or before missionaries, we find a positive effect on income now in China just based on the missionaries that shifted during droughts and floods. So all these natural experiments sort of demonstrate that it's probably causal that they have these effects on outcomes. Now, when we look at cross-national data, we find a positive effect of missionaries on literacy, life expectancy, infant mortality, corruption, economic development, and political democracy. These effects are large. So, for example, the extent of Protestant missionaries in the past explains half of the variation in democracy in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Oceania. And these results are very, very robust. They remove most of the effects that people have been writing about for the past 40 years. They're huge effects, statistically. It seems highly plausible that even if we don't believe that missionaries caused all of these effects, they only caused part of them, they certainly have had a profound influence on the world.
I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum from Kyle, so I'm going to be dealing with Pentecostals, a movement that began in the early part of the 20th century. And I just want to make the disclaimer, I'm not a Pentecostal, so if I say very positive things about Pentecostals, it's not out of a personal agenda. Trying to think how my comments relate to religious freedom was a bit challenging, but I had a minor revelation during lunch, which is that I think so far we've basically heard two perspectives on the relationship between freedom and Christianity. One being that Christianity is under threat, it's being persecuted, the first panel, and then several panels dealing with the idea that Christianity is the source of ideas about religious freedom and liberty. And I'm going to take actually a third approach, which is to deal with religious vitality. And my argument in brief is that Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity in the last 100 years or so has really given a very sharp boost to not only church planting and the expansion of Christianity, but also to the renewal of Christian worship, Christian ritual, and various theological ideas. Let me just, first of all, say briefly what Pentecostalism is, for those of you for whom this may be a somewhat new term. It obviously has its origins in the book of Acts and the day of Pentecost, but it's really pointing back to the early part of the 20th century, and specifically the Azusa Street revivals, which happened to occur in my hometown of Los Angeles in 1906. Some of the defining characteristics of Pentecostalism then and now is a focus on speaking in tongues, an emphasis upon supernatural healing, and various forms of ecstatic worship. Today, there are a number of what might be viewed as historic Pentecostal denominations, such as the Assemblies of God, the Church of God in Christ, and others, but there also are numerous indigenous denominations that have had their start in Brazil, in Nigeria, and locations actually all over the world. And also sort of offshoots from these of what are sometimes called neo-Pentecostal churches, many of which are very indigenous to their location, but are not actually formalized as part of any particular denomination. The Catholic Charismatic Renewal Movement began in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and currently it is about 80 million people. These statistics are always difficult to determine, and the Charismatic Renewal Movement is part of the larger phenomenon of what I want to talk about, and so I'm going to sort of use the hybrid of Pentecostal and Charismatic. There are perhaps 500 million Pentecostals and Charismatics globally, or about 1/4 of all Christians fit that particular classification. Many of the largest congregations in the world are Pentecostal or Charismatic. It's not at all unusual to have congregations that are 20, 30, 40,000, or in Nigeria, which I think we'll have a panel tomorrow on this. There's something called the Holy Ghost Congress, which recently had 3 million under one roof. Really an incredible gathering of Christians. There is a sense in which Pentecostalism is sometimes viewed as stealing the sheep of mainline Protestants as well as Roman Catholics. Just to take one example as a statistic, in 1940, in all of Latin America, perhaps only 1% were Protestant. Today, at least 12% of the population of Latin America is Protestant, and about 75% of those Protestants are Pentecostal. A very interesting survey was done a few years ago by the Pew Forum, which found some surprising things that countered some of the stereotypes about Pentecostalism. One is that stereotypically Pentecostals have been thought of as coming from the sort of the lowest socioeconomic groups of a society. They in fact found in their survey of 10 different countries that Pentecostals are not disproportionately poor. Also, Pentecostals are oftentimes thought of as very otherworldly. In the Pew Forum survey, they found that Pentecostals are as politically progressive as any other religious group, particularly Christian groups. And also, somewhat to at least my surprise, many Pentecostals said they had had an experience of healing rather than simply speaking in tongues. Also, if I had time, I'd cite a lot of other statistics, but just to give you an idea of the size of Pentecostal and charismatic groups. For example, in Guatemala, the Pew Forum survey found that about 60% of the population identified themselves as Pentecostal or charismatic. In Kenya, over 50%. In the Philippines, just under 50%. Now, in the very sort of brief time that I have, I want to talk about the DNA of Pentecostalism and why I see it as a renewal, a revitalizing force within global Christianity. And I'll very quickly just mention 6 or 7 characteristics. One is that Pentecostalism, although it's very different, takes many different forms, tends to have a democratizing impact on Christianity in the sense that it focuses on the priesthood of all believers. So it really challenges a lot of hierarchical notions organizationally of many Christian denominations or Christian churches. This is exemplified particularly in cell groups. Many, in fact, I would say most of the large Pentecostal groups that I've been able to look at in about 20 different countries in the last 10 or 15 years, they have cell groups comprised of 10 to 15 people. These are lay-led, and the clergy simply see themselves as trainers of the laity in order to do the actual ministry of the people, the cell groups being one sociological form of that. Secondly, is a characteristic, there is inevitably a focus on religious experience. Some of that takes an ecstatic form. Other times it's prophecy, it's visions, it's dreams. But what I found remarkable in my own research is the extremely bold and oftentimes creative ideas that accompany these visions, some of which deal with starting new churches, engaging in missionary activity, and so forth. Thirdly, there is an adaptability of Pentecostalism, which takes the model of the early Christian church, but then sort of jumps to in this case, the 21st century, and figures out ways to contextualize the Christian gospel, not bound by tradition of what has been done, but seeking ways in which to minister to people in social ministries, as well as contextualize the basic teachings of Christianity. Fourthly, there is a very strong emphasis on the idea that they have the truth with a capital T. I think this leads to a kind of risk-taking, big ideas where they believe that they are the ones that have the truth, and therefore they have an obligation and a role to evangelize. Let me just end the DNA part, and then I'll just say a couple more things because I know my time is running out here. The most surprising thing to me in terms of visiting literally hundreds of these churches is the character of the worship. The worship is oftentimes very contemporary. People who have been entertaining in nightclubs, professional entertainers, they have some kind of conversion experience, and they bring their music right into the church. The only thing that changes are the lyrics. And I think that this is having a huge impact on the appeal of Pentecostalism to a younger generation. And so you find a kind of vitality within the worship of these churches that includes bodily movement. So it's connecting the mind as well as the body in dance and other expressions. Now, I think I better just stop there, and I'll try to make a better bridge to religious freedom if we have time during the Q&A.
It is a common conviction, perhaps even the dominant conviction among Western intellectuals, that the historical rise of liberal democracy required that politics be cast free from Christianity. The implication is that Christians did not favor liberal democracy during the historical periods in which it took shape. Rather, they were monarchists or reactionaries, or they pined for a return to the medieval world. Perhaps much later, after liberal democracy was well established, Christians came around to accepting it. But this was only an acquiescence to something that was pioneered by secular people. In fact, even today, the loyalty of Christians to liberal democracy is suspect. The more religious people are, the conviction runs, the less likely are they to play by the rules of the democratic game. A strikingly wide variety of intellectuals hold this conviction, including ones who are favorable to liberal democracy and those who are skeptical, and Christians as well as non-Christians. One version of the conviction is what might be called the secular liberal narrative. It is the conviction of John Rawls, the greatest political philosopher of the past generation in the English-speaking world, and of Mark Lilla, author of The Stillborn God. Both Rawls and Lilla believe that liberal democracy is the inspiration of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, and that it required putting aside classic Christianity, which gave us theocracy and religious wars. It is also the conviction of many of the followers of the great philosopher Leo Strauss. All of these thinkers are broadly sympathetic to liberal democracy. The same historical story is told, however, by thinkers who are skeptical or wary of liberal democracy, at least to some degree, like Pierre Manont, who believes that liberal democracy was formed by putting aside Christianity. It is also told by certain Christian intellectuals like David Schindler, who stresses the profound incompatibility of Christianity and liberalism. All of these thinkers, as well as a large throng of popular writers, holds that on the road to liberty, Christianity was a straggler, a hindrance, or a principled bystander. But does this narrative get history right? Did the rise of liberal democracy really require the marginalization of Christianity? My paper examines this claim by looking at the critical period of 1800 to 2000. I only look at 200 years of history, when modern liberal democratic institutions saw their most rapid development. This took place in Europe, North America, and Latin America. My conclusion is that this narrative needs to be sharply revised. In fact, numerous prominent Christians advocated and advanced political liberty during this period in historically enduring ways. I say revised rather than rejected because it is doubtless true that many Christians did not advocate liberty. Many were indeed monarchists and reactionaries. Still, the narrative must be strongly revised, and in arguing for this revision, I make three claims in particular. The first claim is that throughout this period, Christian thinkers and leaders advocated for an expansion of liberty, whether this meant a widening of the franchise, the freeing of slaves, the toppling of dictatorships, or the legal guarantee of religious freedom. I demonstrate this with respect to 8 Western countries in the period 1800 to 1970, and then on a widened global scale from 1970 to the present. I argue that Christian advocates of liberal democracy were ahead of their own regime often, and sometimes ahead of their secular counterparts. Though I make no effort to compare the number and power of Christian advocates of liberal democracy with those of Christians who oppose liberal democracy, I argue that the advocates were numerous, often prominent, and of enduring historical significance. Let me mention a few, some of whom will be familiar. A pioneer of the whole trend was Francis Félicité Lamennais, a Catholic thinker who during the middle of his career in the late 1820s became convinced that the Catholic Church and Catholic principles could best influence French society in an atmosphere of religious freedom and liberal democratic government. He was fiercely loyal to the Pope, and like most French Catholics, was fiercely opposed to the French Revolution. But he broke with other French Catholics in opposing monarchy and an established church. Sadly, Pope Gregory XVI did not reciprocate Lamennais' affection, condemning his liberalism and leaving him embittered and alienated from the church. Figures in the 19th century and early 20th century who thought like him included Charles Montalembert, Henri Dominique Lacordaire, and Félix Dupanloup, a bishop in France, Bishop Wilhelm von Kettler in Germany, Abraham Kuyper and Hermanus Scheepman in the Netherlands, John Henry Newman and Lord Acton in England, Orestes Brownson, Jacques Maritain, John Courtney Murray, and Cardinal James Gibbons in the United States, and Luigi Sturzo and Alcide de Gasperi in Italy. After 1970, my second period, Christian churches and Christian parties played a central role in what is known as the third wave of democratization. Especially important were the Catholic Church in Poland, Lithuania, Portugal, Spain, the Philippines, Chile, Brazil, Guatemala, and Malawi, and Protestant churches in Eastern Germany, South Africa, and South Korea. My second claim, and this resonates with Kyle Harper's argument, I believe, is that Christian advocates of liberal democracy during this period made their case on distinctive Christian grounds. They did not simply borrow or come around to accepting arguments from the Enlightenment tradition that made no reference to God. In fact, many of the figures that I just mentioned were quite keen to differentiate their arguments from those of Kant, Locke, and Rousseau. Rather, they argued on the basis of reasons that they drew from the classic Christian tradition, and in the Catholic case, were consistent with the enduring dogmatic teachings of the Catholic Church. Put differently, they were Christian liberals, not liberal Christians. For example, some argued that religious belief by its, by its very nature cannot be coerced, and that therefore religious freedom should be protected in law. Others argued that a transcendent God embodies a law to which governments ought to be held accountable, and thus demands limited government. Still others held that since God created human beings equal in dignity, every person has human rights, not to be enslaved, tortured, or arbitrarily detained. The third claim is that Christian liberals usually made their case in an atmosphere in which their own liberty to practice their faith was curtailed or assaulted. Lamennais faced opposition from both the government and his own church. Protestant liberals in Germany and in the early 19th century were suppressed by the Prussian state. Later, von Kettler advocated freedom amidst a brutal Kulturkampf waged by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Churches in the third wave of democracy advocated freedom under the thumb of dictatorships. This varied, to be sure, with respect to the regime and the Christian church involved. Still, the curtailment of liberalism was common and carries two implications. First, it helps to explain the stance of Christians who did not embrace liberalism. While in some cases their refusal arose from a yen for the ancien regime, in many cases it was a reaction to liberalism's illiberalism, that is, an ironic hostility to religious freedom on the part of otherwise liberal regimes. The consistent hostility towards liberalism of 19th century popes, for instance, was rooted in the fact, in part, that liberalism was advocated by the legatees of the French Revolution. Their version of liberal democracy typically involved a sharp curtailment of the authority of the Catholic Church, Catholic education, monasteries, and other Catholic institutions, and was rooted in philosophical commitments that were hostile to those of the Church. Popes like Gregory XVI, Pius IX, Pius X, and to a lesser extent Leo XIII, did not separate their evaluation of liberal democratic institutions from their concern about relativistic philosophy and attacks on the church. So the second implication is that it meant that Christians who advocated for a liberalism that also included religious liberty were in this respect more truly liberal than secular anti-clerical liberals. In the Netherlands, for instance, Catholics were ahead of secular liberals in advocating both the universal franchise and freedom for religious education. In Germany, Catholic liberals argued for a far healthier pluralism than was advocated for by Bismarck. In the third wave of democratization, Christian churches opposed atheistic communist governments, but also sometimes Christian dictatorships, and advocating for liberal democracy in which the religious could practice their faith. Christians thus gained credibility in their claim to be innovators, not laggards, in the historical development of political liberty. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the four panelists. Before we take questions from the audience, I think across this very wide range of time and place that we looked at, I'm struck all four of you are making arguments in different ways about certain Christian thinkers or Christian communities making transcendent truth claims grounded in a particular Christian theological tradition or a particular understanding of the Christian scriptures. But these transcendent truth claims are being realized in very particular historical circumstances. Gregory of Nyssa in the fourth century, 19th century Protestant movements, the Azusa Street revivals of 1906 and their follow-ons, or again, 19th century Christian political thought. How do you think about the relationship between contingency and transcendence? I mean, how do you think about, in each of these cases, the relationship between particular historical circumstances and these much larger universal truth claims being made? Why didn't Gregory of Nyssa come along in the 2nd century or the 6th? Why didn't democracy arise in the 16th century rather than 19th? These things.
That's a great question. It's a big question. And I'll start with the kind of specific way you put it at the end. Why didn't Gregory of Nyssa come along in the 2nd century? Because I think that's important. The theological ideas are there, the emphasis on freedom and dignity. The material, the raw material is there in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. But what's different about the contingent circumstances of the 4th century are the role of Christian leaders, especially bishops, within society. And that's a watershed, because before, I think, the conversion of Constantine, to a large extent, Christianity is a resistance movement against Roman Empire and Roman power. And in a sense, in some sense, isn't therefore responsible for the conditions of the world. But it's really a watershed. After that conversion of Constantine, the triumph of the church, that the church is confronted in a new way by circumstances with the problems of the world and is forced to respond to them. Now, the other aspect of contingency that's important in this period is that I'm drawing selectively, very selectively, on certain individuals who have what I would characterize as a certain kind of moral courage and clarity and persistence to think through the logical conclusions of their premises. And they are the exception in most cases rather than the rule in their own time. And I think that may actually raise some interesting comparisons with Dan's talk about the 18th and 19th century, where there's an important distinction to be drawn between some Christians and Christianity. And so I think it's worth just pausing to admire the individuals that have had a certain kind of moral courage in the face of the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Oh yeah, turn it on. I think part of the link of it is that people are not only motivated by religion, they're also motivated by economic and political and other interests, only one of which is religion. So if we look at the case of Protestant missionaries, for example, in South Africa, the ones that were not financed by white settlers were the main people who critiqued a lot of the abuses by the white settlers, the Methodists and others from England and from the US and from Sweden. And the Afrikaans missionaries that were financed by white settlers some of them were the architects of apartheid. So, I mean, they were shaped by the interests of their community and the interests of the people who financed them. Same thing in terms of missionaries critiquing abuses. When they were financed by the state or when they were financed by white settlers, they didn't tend to critique the people who paid their bills. That's the crucialness of them being non-state, because then they were more independent to actually critique abuses that they thought were wrong, but also that influenced their ability to convert people.
For Pentecostals, certainly their truth claims are informed by Scripture, but I think more fundamentally, and this wasn't in your list, they're informed and verified through religious experience. And so religious experience plays an extremely important role, much more so than tradition, for example, plays a role. And it also, there's an individualism, in a sense, to Pentecostal theology, that it's through one's personal experience through the Holy Spirit that one knows the truth of the Christian gospel. And the other thing I would add is prayer and the discipline of prayer plays an enormous role in empowering the zeal, whether it be missionary activity or other activities such as social ministries.
Yeah, it's a great question about the combination of transcendence and contingency. In 2006, Pope Benedict offered a Christmas address in which he talked about the historical evolution of the Church's stance on religious freedom. And he said something surprising when he credited the Enlightenment for this. And what he was saying was that the Enlightenment spurred a kind of grand historical dialogue in which the Church kind of eventually took up this idea. But he also made very clear that the Church eventually grounded religious freedom on a very different kind of foundation than the Enlightenment. So in a kind of historical genealogical sense, I heard talk about genealogy, one can say that the Enlightenment thought, as Kyle said, it brought the rights of man and the Declaration of Independence and so forth, was part of this historical process that brought this about, even if the philosophical grounds were kind of suspect and still are in the church's eyes. And so there were some historical circumstances, and I think liberal democracy also requires things like a reading public, a level of economic advancement, middle class, modern communications, and other things that modernity has helped to bring about. So I do think there are some historical circumstances, but the set of people that I'm talking about in the paper are also ones, though, who engage these particular historical circumstances, but then we're able to reach back into the tradition and find enduring transcendent ideas on which to ground these institutions. And so you end up with this kind of synthesis of contingent and transcendent, just like you say.
Questions from the audience? Yes, back here. Try it again.
There we go. Okay, sorry. Michael Dreesen from John Cabot University in Rome. I'm very sympathetic to this reading of, remembering of the Christian sort of roots of human rights and democracy, and sort of the necessity to think about that in our policy making. I want to jump here on this idea of Christian liberal that Dan, that you brought up, and just ask you, the idea itself, Christian liberal, seems to have an implication for a different idea of religious liberty than a secular liberal idea would, right? Mm-hmm. And we can think about that in many examples that you give, Christian democratic examples, in which you propose maybe a greater role for the church in public life. I want to know what sort of lessons you take away from that for the policy consequences. If religious liberty or an idea of Christian liberalism, is it so different? Does it create a different sort of grounding for religious liberty? Is there a different model there? A different model for the institutionalization of the church within public life? Sort of what are your salient features, the salient policy features of this sort of Christian liberal idea? If you could maybe say a little more about it.
Sure. So I make a distinction between liberal Christianity and Christian liberals. In order to understand that distinction, you also need another distinction between liberal institutions and laws based on human rights, democracy, elections, and so forth, from liberal philosophy. And again, that's a broad term and probably lots of distinctions, but I broadly mean the kind of underpinning offered by Enlightenment thinkers, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and so forth. And what my paper is about are about Christians who came to advocate liberal institutions, but they did so on grounds that were different, and very self-consciously did so on grounds that were different, rather than putting them on the kind of Enlightenment footing, put them on the footing of classic Christian ideas and concepts. And so it's a different way of grounding and thinking about liberal democratic institutions. And I think you can see this very concretely realized in still today in public debates between different parties of people who advocate, who both agree upon liberal democratic institutions, but are going to advocate different kinds of policies based on this different kind of grounding. I mean, I think some of the debates we see in the United States and in Western Europe today about religious freedom and its role in things like the Health and Human Services mandate, or the way in which policies regarding sexuality intersect with regulations on the churches and so forth. Where are the boundaries of religious freedom? I think this is a kind of debate where you see a sharp difference between this kind of Enlightenment-style liberals and then the people who are advocating liberal institutions based on classical Christian ideas. I mean, religious freedom, after all, is kind of a liberal idea, but if you ground it in kind of the classic Christian sense, you're going to get a different set of answers. And so that's an example of how I think we see that playing out in the policy realm.
Yes, right here.
Yeah, John Rist. I'm puzzled by the discussion because the word democracy seems to be being thrown around in a rather vague way. I think we've had some pretty good examples in recent history that we can use the word democracy for activities which are not democratic at all. Obviously, a good example of this is when the so-called Arab Spring occurred. We were talking about that democracy is a situation where you have an election. But of course, democracy should be a matter of having democratic means to democratic ends. The two can't be separated. So when we talk about Christianity to democracy, it would seem useful to be able to define exactly what kind of democracy we're talking about in the 21st century.
When I do my work on democracy, I use the term liberal democracy. The measures that I use statistically for it, but also in terms of my historical arguments, are much broader than elections. They include freedom of speech, freedom of association, independence of the courts from executive control, rule of law, things like that. It's a quite broad definition that I use and is reflected in the measures that I use statistically.
Yeah, it's a point well taken that these things don't always go together. And in my paper, I probably use it too broadly and loosely. It's certainly possible to have, for instance, democracy in the sense of elections without having liberal rights. And there are many countries in the world which today can be called illiberal democracies. They have pretty robust electoral systems, but they're very lacking in things like religious freedom. So it's a point well taken.
Robert McCulloch. Daniel, I'd just like to pick up in the last sentence. It's written in the summary of your address there that Christians were innovators in the historical development of freedom. And picking up what you were saying there, Kyle, on that breakthrough point in the person of Gregory of Nyssa, would seem to me that one of the persons or a significant breakthrough point that came after that, which would follow then on what you were saying, Daniel, about an innovator in the historical development of freedom, would have been the rule of St. Benedict. Especially when we're talking about in the overall topic of this segment of Christian views on dignity and slavery and democracy, what the vision and the spirit that was engendered through the rule of Benedict, which has had such an influence really, and even to the present, within such a wide segment and spectrum of the Christian experience.
I just add a brief comment that for a historian of late antiquity, in many ways, the rule of St. Benedict is a culmination of 2 centuries of ascetic experiment and ferment. And people like Gregory of Nyssa, although their bishops are very much pioneers in the ascetic movement in the 4th century. And I think there's a kind of link there as well, in that their willingness to try and step outside of the kind of cycles of ordinary life, cultivate a kind of perspective on the problems of ordinary social life as well. And so the kind of consciousness that Gregory of Nyssa and others in his age have is, I think, informed by the experience of asceticism. And then the rule of Benedict in a different way is a way to try and institutionalize some of the ideals of charity that are, I think, very closely connected to the views on dignity that I've talked about.
Yeah. I mean, I largely agree. I was trying to be duly obedient to the editors and confining my paper to the period of 1800 to 2000, which is already far too large. But I agree. I think separation of powers, limited government, human rights, all sorts of features of constitutional liberal democracy, I think, find origins in the early church and the medieval era, and we could talk about conciliarism, and before the Enlightenment, there were lots of foundations laid in lots of different ways.
We had a question. Yes. Turn it on.
Devo parlare in italiano, spero che mi farò capire. Mi chiamo Paul Mambe Shambayo Kassa, sono giurista e mi occupo della ricerca sull'inculturazione in diritto canonico. Mi interesso l'argomento che ha toccato Robert, missionari protestanti, imperialisti culturali oppure promotori della democrazia. Sono contento che sia toccato questo, ma come l'ha sottolineato Moderatore, l'argomento è un po' eteroclito perché anche tocca tanti periodi della storia che non è facile toccare globalmente in una domanda. Io riconosco da cattolico che i protestanti anche in Congo, che non è Congo belga, ex Congo belga, adesso siamo Repubblica Democratica del Congo, i protestanti hanno lavorato tanto per la stampa, hanno tradotto anche la Bibbia prima dei cattolici. Io la prima volta che ho toccato la Bibbia senza pensare che era un peccato è quando sono entrato in seminario maggiore, perché prima era vietato di aprire anche la Bibbia, ma coloro che toccavano la Bibbia in quel momento, che distribuivano, erano protestanti. Quindi sono contento perché quelli lì su quell'ambito ci hanno dimostrato veramente un modo di evangelizzare che adesso impariamo da fare. Ma ciò che volevo dire è che il Congo è formato di tante etnie, tante culture praticamente, è stato uno Stato organizzato, creato da tutti i paesi dal 1885, come lo sapete, dall'inizio i colonizzatori l'ha costituito così e noi siamo ex Congo belga, siamo diventati Zaire, adesso Repubblica Democratica del Congo. Ma cosa accade? In Africa di natura, sul piano religioso, non c'era una discussione. Nessuna tribù imponeva l'idea di Dio a un'altra persona. Si presentava come un fatto privato, chiedere a qualcuno a che Dio credi, e ognuno di noi chiamava Dio secondo la sua lingua, secondo che Dio, gli antenati l'hanno insegnato, e nessuno faceva una guerra all'altro perché non crede al Dio dei suoi antenati o come lo chiamavano. Ognuno lo chiamava democraticamente, a modo suo per dire. Però quando arrivano i missionari, che siano cattolici e protestanti, arriva un elemento, un Dio di unità, un Dio che porta la Bibbia. Ma con questa stessa Bibbia portano le divisioni tra di loro, perché i protestanti dove si fermavano, i cattolici erano lì. E se la stessa famiglia, un membro era nella Chiesa cattolica, si incontrava i protestanti, era già discriminato, c'era una guerra in famiglia. E adesso questa situazione sicuramente sta cambiando, però a partire da divisioni delle religiose che non esisteva perché l'idea di conflitto è tra le etnie per altri motivi, ma il fatto religioso non lo era prima che le religioni monoteistiche mettano i piedi nelle nostre foreste. E lì chiederò, se queste 3 religioni o 4 o 5 che volete che sono monoteisti sono veramente le religioni a promuovere la democrazia o le divisioni? Questa è la prima questione. Un altro elemento è...
Okay, we're going to stop at that one question. All right, thanks.
E allora che faccio? Se c'è tempo... va bene allora, mi fermo.
Well, it's hard to know. Oh, sorry. It's hard to know how much division or what people thought about before missionaries came because we don't typically have written records. So we know there was a lot of conflict between groups. Some of it was over the slave trade, some of it was over other things. But it's hard to know what was there before in any kind of sort of solid way because we don't have written records. There were no written languages. Now, they did bring in divisions, additional divisions. They did moderate other divisions. So if you look at societies, often missionaries helped moderate some ethnic conflicts. They did accentuate other ones. So there was Protestant-Catholic conflict in Africa that was accentuated, particularly in places where there was conflict with relationship with the state, as there was in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. I was using Belgian Congo just to compare it with French Congo during the colonial period. Because Protestants were involved in the sort of exposing the atrocities, they got punished by the government, and so anyone who graduated from a Protestant school could not go to get a government job or other things like that. So there's all kinds of punishments that were imposed on them, and you get tensions that develop between religious groups there. But I also think just in general, Protestant missions more than Catholic missions accentuated ethnic differences because of the translation of the Bible into local vernacular languages and education in those languages, rather than using the colonial languages, which the Catholic education tended to be more in colonial languages. And that sometimes accentuated ethnic divisions, which could lead to conflict. So, but I don't think it's quite as stark as like that there was no conflict before. I think some conflicts were moderated and other conflicts were accentuated through missions, but particularly through Protestant missions, but then also in terms of conflict that developed between Protestants and Catholics, which sometimes was, at that time, was quite unhealthy.
Sì, a nome della religione di Dio no, a nome di Dio non è si è fatto le guerre tra le tribù a nome di Dio. Quello che volevo dire, sono contento della risposta perché c'era questa accentuazione dei conflitti, come l'hai detto, però a nome di Dio, quello che volevo sottolineare, a nome di un Dio che è creatore, che è chiamato diversamente da tutte le tribù, non si facevano delle guerre. E per questo che facevo la domanda. Adesso non è che lottiamo, perché partendo anche di questo fatti di oggi, non è il problema soltanto tra protestanti e cattolici, ma le sette che nascono ogni giorno in Congo, che vengono dall'America, che vengono anche dall'Asia, dall'America. A nome della stessa Bibbia abbiamo tante sette, e portando lo stesso strumento, e che ci sono più divisioni che di prima, perché si fa delle prediche per criticarsi. Almeno i cattolici cercano di parlare della riconciliazione, i protestanti tradizionali, però gli altri non sembra che la Bibbia in quel momento porta l'unità come si aspetta nel pratica, è quello che volevo dire. Se no, sul punto di storico, come le hai detto, c'erano anche i problemi di finanziamenti, perché erano condizionati nell'evangelizzazione, tenendo conto anche da chi erano mandati.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We've been admonished by the keepers of the time that we have no more. But this would be a great conversation to continue over coffee and treats outside. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Certo.